The electoral threshold is the minimum share of the vote which a political party requires to secure any representation in a legislature. This limit can operate in various ways. For example, in party list proportional representation systems, an election threshold requires that a party must receive a specified minimum percentage of votes, either nationally or within a particular district, to obtain any seats in the parliament. If there are a number of multi-member constituencies, each constituency will have a quota, i.e. a minimum percentage of the votes in the constituency to be awarded one seat. The effect of an electoral threshold is to deny representation to small parties and to force them into coalitions, with the presumption of rendering the election system more stable by keeping out radical factions. However, critics point out that in the absence of a ranked ballot system, supporters of minor parties are effectively disenfranchised and denied the right of representation by someone of their choosing. Two boundaries can be defined. A threshold of representation is the minimum vote share that might yield a party a seat, while the threshold of exclusion is the maximum vote share that could be insufficient to yield a seat. legislature.This suggested calculating the informal threshold as the mean of these legal election thresholds in various countries. In Poland's Sejm, Germany's Bundestag and New Zealand's House of Representatives, the threshold is 5%. However, in Germany and New Zealand, if a party wins a minimum number of directly elected seats, 3 in Germany and 1 in New Zealand, the threshold does not apply. The threshold is 3.25% in Israel's Knesset, and 10% in the Turkish parliament. In Poland, ethnic minority parties do not have to reach the threshold level to get into the parliament, and so there is always a small German minority representation in the Sejm. In Romania, for the ethnic minority parties there is a different threshold than for the national parties that run for the Chamber of Deputies. There are also countries such as Portugal, South Africa, Finland, the Netherlands, and the Republic of Macedonia, that have proportional representation systems without a legal threshold, although the Netherlands has a rule that the first seat can never be a remainder seat, which means that there is an effective threshold of 100% divided by the total number of seats. In the Slovenian parliamentary elections of 1992 and 1996, the threshold was set at 3 parliamentary seats. This meant that the parties needed to win about 3.2% of the votes in order to pass the threshold. In 2000, the threshold was raised to 4% of the votes. In Sweden, there is a nationwide threshold of 4%, but if a party reaches 12% in one election district, it will take part in the seat allocation for that district. However, through the 2014 election, nobody has been elected based on the 12% rule. In Norway, the nationwide electoral threshold of 4% applies only to leveling seats. A party with sufficient local support may still win the regular district seats, even if the party fails to meet the threshold. Following the 2009 election, the Liberal Party won 2 seats in this manner. In Australia, which uses a single transferable vote proportional representation system, they avoided the need for a formal electoral threshold by establishing smaller electorates, with each multi-member electorate returning fewer members of a parliament and as such requiring a higher quota percentage in order to be elected. As Australia also uses a ranked voting system, supporters of minor parties are not disenfranchised as the votes are redistributed to other candidates according to the voters' nominated order of preference, which can then form part of another candidate's winning quota. In elections to the Danish Folketing, the electoral threshold is 2% of the valid votes cast in the election. In the United States, as the majority of elections are conducted under the first-past-the-post system, legal election thresholds do not apply in the actual voting. However, Several states have threshold requirements for parties to obtain automatic ballot access to the next general election without having to submit voter-signed petitions. The threshold requirements have no practical bearing on the two main political parties as they easily meet the requirements, but have come into play for minor parties such as the Green and Libertarian parties. The threshold rules also apply for independent candidates to obtain ballot access. Countries can have more than one threshold. Germany, as mentioned earlier, has a regular threshold of 5%, but a party winning 3 constituency seats in the Bundestag can gain additional representation even if it has achieved under 5% of the total vote. Most multiple threshold systems are still in the proposal stage. For example, in Canada, one proposal to reform the electoral system would see a 5% national threshold, 1% of the vote and 1 seat in the House of Commons, or 2% nationally and 15% of the vote in any one province. Election thresholds are often implemented with the intention of bringing stability to the political system. The Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe recommends for parliamentary elections a threshold not higher than 3%. However, a 2007 European Court of Human Rights decision, Umikan Sadak v. Turkey, held that Turkey's 10% threshold did not violate Article 3 of Protocol 1 of the ECHR, because Turkey has no limits for independent candidates. The 10% rule has to some extent been circumvented by parties running candidates as independents. Europe. Other continents' notable failures to reach the threshold. Examples of elections where established parties fall below the threshold are Turkey, 2002. All 5 parties that passed the 10% threshold in 1999 elections, as well as 2 other major parties, failed to pass the threshold in 2002, rocking the Turkish politics to its foundations. Notably, DYP got 9.55%, MHP got 8.34%, GP got 7.25%, DEHAP got 6.23%, ANAP got 5.13%, SP got 2.48% and DSP got 1.22%, all falling below the threshold. In total, 33% of the votes, i.e. 14,545,438 votes, were without representation in the parliament. Germany, 2013. The Free Democratic Party got only 4.8% of the votes, so did not meet the 5% threshold. It did not win any directly elected seats either. It hasn't won a directly elected seat since 1990. Hence, for the first time since 1949, the party was not represented in the Bundestag, and their ally the Christian Democratic Union had to form a grand coalition with the Social Democratic Party. New Zealand, 2008. The New Zealand First Party got only 4.07% of the list vote, so it was not returned to Parliament, but the ACT New Zealand Party only won 3.65% of the list vote, but remained in Parliament as its leader won an electorate seat. As a result, it was allocated 3 list seats, also the coattail effect. The New Zealand First Party had been in Parliament since 1993, and returned in 2011. Norway, 2009. The Liberal Party got 3.9% of the votes, below the 4% threshold for levelling seats, although still winning 2 seats. Hence, while right-wing opposition parties won more votes between them than the parties in the governing coalition, the narrow failure of the Liberal Party to cross the threshold led to the governing coalition continuing in power. The Liberal Party is the oldest Norwegian party, established in 1884, and reached the threshold with 5.2% of votes in 2013. Israel, 1992. The extreme right-wing TFEU got 1.2% of the votes, which was below the threshold it itself had previously voted to raise to 1.5%. It thus lost its 3 seats, losing a critical seat for the Israeli right, and leading to an electoral turnover, establishing the left-wing government of Yitzhak Rabin. The amount of unrepresented vote. Election thresholds can sometimes seriously affect the relationship between the percentages of the popular vote achieved by each party and the distribution of seats. In the Russian parliamentary elections in 1995, with the threshold excluding parties under 5%, more than 45% of votes went to parties that failed to reach the threshold. In 1998, the Russian Constitutional Court found the threshold legal, taking into account limits in its use. There has been a similar position in Turkey, which has a 10% threshold, easily higher than in any other country. The justification for such a high threshold was to prevent multi-party coalitions and put a stop to the endless fragmentation of political parties, seen in the 1960s and 1970s. However, coalitions ruled between 1991 and 2002. Mainstream parties continued to be fragmented, and in the 2002 elections as many as 45% of votes were cast for parties which failed to reach the threshold and were thus unrepresented in the parliament. In the Ukrainian elections of March 2006, for which there was a threshold of 3%, 22% of voters were effectively disenfranchised, having voted for minor candidates. In the parliamentary election held under the same system, fewer voters supported minor parties, and the total percentage of disenfranchised voters fell to about 12%. In Bulgaria, 24% of voters cast the ballots for parties that would not gain representation in the elections of 1991 and 2013. In the Philippines, where party list seats are only contested in 20% of the 287 seats in the lower house, the effect of the 2% threshold is increased by the large number of parties participating in the election, which means that the threshold is harder to reach. This led to a quarter of valid votes being wasted, on average, and led to the 20% of the seats never being allocated due to the 3-seat cap. In 2007, the 2% threshold was altered to allow parties with less than 1% of first preferences to receive a seat each. The proportion of wasted votes reduced slightly to 21%, but it again increased to 29% in 2010 due to an increase in number of participating parties. These statistics take no account of the wasted votes for a party which is entitled to more than 3 seats but cannot claim those seats due to the 3-seat cap. Election thresholds can produce a spoiler effect, similar to that in the first-past-the-post voting system, in which minor parties unable to reach the threshold take votes away from other parties with similar ideologies. Fledgling parties in these systems often find themselves in a vicious circle. If a party is perceived as having no chance of meeting the threshold, it often cannot gain popular support, and if the party cannot gain popular support, it will continue to have little or no chance of meeting the threshold, as well as acting against extremist parties. It may also adversely affect moderate parties if the political climate becomes polarized between two major parties at opposite ends of the political spectrum. In such a scenario, moderate voters may abandon the preferred party in favor of a more popular party in the hope of keeping the even less desirable alternative out of power. On occasion, election thresholds have resulted in a party winning an outright majority of seats without winning an outright majority of votes, the sort of outcome that a proportional voting system is supposed to prevent. For instance, the Turkish AK party won a majority of seats with less than 50% of votes in 3 consecutive elections. In contrast, elections which use the ranked voting system can take account of each voter's complete indicated ranking preference. For example, the single transferable vote redistributes first preference votes for candidates below the threshold. This permits the continued participation in the election by those whose votes would otherwise be wasted. Minor parties can indicate to the supporters before the vote how they would wish to see the votes transferred. Ranked voting systems are widely used in Australia and Ireland.